Hi guys, so I'm out today and I'm not going to be available to give you the direct instruction in person, but these are some very important concepts. So I'm recording them here for you to access and has the nice advantage of you being able to pause the presentation for note-taking purposes. This is being done on the fly, so I apologize if I don't have the fluency that I would have if I had a script in front of me, and I'll try to limit my pauses and ums and ahs, which can be annoying, I know. So this is the pre-teaching for our first topic of Chinese history, the Qing Dynasty. The Qing were a ruling family or dynasty, and they were actually the last in Chinese history. Over the thousands of years of Chinese history, there were many different ruling regimes, and we call these different dynasties. If any of you in middle school studied Egyptian history, it's similarly divided. Ancient Egyptian history is divided into dynasties. So the Qing were the last ruling clique, ruling group in imperial Chinese history. The Qing dynasty started in 1644 and ended in 1911. The Qing dynasty is synonymous with one of the ethnic groups of China, and that's the Manchus. And the first problem that I usually have with students approaching the Qing dynasty is knowing who the Manchus were. When I say that they were a group of barbarians from northeastern China, the first thing most people envision are the Huns from Mulan, and that is not who these people were. If you are familiar with the Mongols and the Huns, these are nomadic groups from Central Asia who are very much mobile and horseback warrior peoples. The Manchus had a close relationship with the Mongols, but they were not themselves the Huns or the Mongols. They were a distinct group of people. So who were they? The Manchus were a group of people who lived in the northeast of China. For most of Chinese history, they were on the periphery of Chinese civilization. Like, they knew who the Chinese were. The Chinese knew who they were. Chinese culture and technological achievements had influence on them, and they kind of drifted in and out of the sphere of Chinese control. The name for northeastern China in the West is Manchuria, and it gets its name from these people, the Manchus. There are still Manchus today. It's one of the ethnic groups of China, and most of them are still located in the northeast. Historically, they were agriculturalists, which mean they were farmers, but there were some semi-nomadic members who would follow animals for purposes of like hunting or gathering, and most of the year would be sedentary. Because of this reliance on hunting to support their agricultural lifestyle, they developed very intense skills in archery and horsemanship. These, of course, were skills that would translate well into combat, so they were very famous warriors. In 1618, the Manchu Khan, that's a title, so the leader of the Manchus, Nurhaci, renounced control by the Chinese. And other tribes nearby that were related to the Manchus revolted against Chinese leadership in a war against the penultimate Chinese dynasty, the Ming, which was a dynasty dominated by the Han ethnicity, which you will recall accounts for about 90% of the Chinese population. Initially, the Manchus were successful in overthrowing Chinese dominance of the Manchus. Over a period of many years, decades, the Manchus slowly but certainly expanded their sphere of control, gobbling up neighboring tribes, building alliances with neighboring peoples, and expanding both to the northeast and to the southwest. As they expanded, they moved their capital to bigger and bigger Chinese cities. If they got a new, larger Chinese city under their control, they'd move their capital there. On the Chinese side, the Ming Dynasty really didn't have a lot of success dealing with the Manchus, despite being richer, despite having a larger population, and despite being more technologically advanced. The reason why they did not have success is because many of the Chinese generals swapped their support from the Ming to the Manchus. If you look at the makeup of Manchu armies, they're only about 16% Manchu. They're actually 75% Han, meaning 3 out of 4 soldiers serving in a Manchu army were Chinese soldiers. Why did so many Ming swap sides to support the Manchus in this war? Well, back in China, there were lots of peasant rebellions that undermined the strength of the dynasty. There was also a lot of confusion at the top as Ming Chinese leaders fought each other for leadership. The Manchus, as they continued to expand and succeed over a period of decades, ultimately would claim that they were a new dynasty. In 1636, they declared themselves to be the Great Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty of Chinese history. And in 1614, they actually succeeded in seizing Beijing, which they made into their capital. The last mutually agreed upon Ming emperor committed suicide. There were other pretenders to the throne, for lack of a better word, who continued to resist the Manchus, particularly in the south of China. And the Manchus had to continue to fight their way south over a period of several more decades. But eventually, the Manchus were able to put down Chinese resistance to their rule. It's worth noting, just a side note, that some Ming loyalists jumped in ships and went to Taiwan with the purpose of ultimately reorganizing an effort to drive the Manchus out of China. This, of course, failed, but it has an interesting precedent for the future of Taiwan being a base for resistance to a regime on the mainland. It's also worth mentioning that it's during this period that the triads and the tongs, these are organized crime and cultural organizations. A lot of them had roots in this period with people who were trying to organize underground resistance to the Manchus, who were seen as outsiders, who were usurping the proper Han control of China. So what was China like under the Manchus? There's a couple of things that we need to discuss that will have important relevance for the rest of the course. Firstly, the Manchus established a racial hegemony in China. The idea was basically that the Manchus were on the top. All Han Chinese men were forced to wear the queue, which is a long braid. You can see that on the right-hand side. These gentlemen have these long braids. And any Han that were serving the government of the Manchus were forced to wear Manchu clothing. This was a way to show their subordination to Manchu rule. If you violated this rule, if you were a Han Chinese man and you did not wear the queue, the penalty was death by decapitation. So this was a very strictly enforced rule. Manchus lived in separate garrisons within Chinese cities. The idea was to create enclaves of loyalists to the regime, to the Qing, who, in the case of a rebellion by the Han, would be willing to support the government against the rebels. Within the military, special units were created. They were reserved initially for loyalists who had served the Manchus in the conquest of China. And as time went on, Han were purged from their ranks, and eventually they would become basically Manchu and Mongol units, and they were called the Eight Banners, these elite units loyal to the emperor. And then lastly, the highest ranks in the government were reserved for Manchus. Of course, the emperor is a Manchu. The Grand Council, the Deliberative Council of princes and high officials, basically the emperor's cabinet, were dominated by Manchus. And there was a separate Manchu officialdom. Basically, if you were in a city, there would be a Han governor for the Han Chinese, and then a Manchu governor for the Manchus. And the Manchu official was seen as the dominant one under the Qing regime. One more thing before I proceed from the slide. In the top right-hand side, you can see that elite women in China were similarly expected to adopt Manchu dress. Despite setting up a racial hegemony, under the Manchus, China basically made the Manchus more Chinese. This is understandable because the Manchus were relatively small compared to the enormous population of Han Chinese. So as the centuries passed, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, the Manchus adopted the Chinese language, so they became Mandarin speakers. You might recall me saying in class that Mandarin actually refers to the fact that it was the language of Manchu officials. And they also adopted Chinese customs. So the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Manchu conquerors basically walk, talk, look, and act Han. The Manchus preserved the Chinese examination system for government service. We haven't talked about this yet in great depth, but we will. There was a system in place under Imperial China by which talented people could take an examination system on the Confucian classics, and if you passed at an acceptable level, you were eligible for service in the imperial government. It was basically a way to reward merit and to advance talented people into the aristocracy. That having been said, it was an incredibly difficult test, and ultimately the highest levels of the examination would be only passed by less than 1% of applicants. And to prepare for it was very difficult. It took years and lots of money. So the only people who were eligible, really, to take this test with any hope of passing were high-ranking Chinese elites. And these positions in the examination system were usually dominated by rich Han Chinese serving the Manchus. Most of the officials in the government, as I said, because of that, were Han Chinese, even if they were kind of second class because they weren't Mandarins. And most soldiers in the Qing armies were also Han. The standout there are the Green Standard Armies, which would form the sort of backbone of the Qing military. And those were all full Han Chinese. That makes sense because there were more Han Chinese than anybody else. Under the Manchus, foreign relations looked very different at the start of the Qing dynasty than they would near the end. China was used historically to being the dominant civilized power in East Asia. They were by far the oldest civilization in the region. They were by far the largest civilization in the region. They were by far the richest civilization in the region. And because of the Taklamakan and the Tian Shan and the Himalaya, they'd had only limited contact with other great civilizations. So the other nations around China were either smaller civilized powers that were satellites of China, like Korea, or they were less civilized dependencies that moved in and out of China's control, like Vietnam, or they were uncivilized barbarians on the edge of Chinese society, like the Mongols and other Central Asian nomads. Because of this experience, China considered itself the Middle Kingdom, the center of the civilized world. We are the great power, and everyone else around us is a reflection of our great civilization, or subordinate to our great civilization. Because of that, when China interacted with foreigners, they really expected it to be a unequal relationship. The other country would have to acknowledge the superiority of Chinese civilization. They were expected to pay an annual tribute, which was basically gifts to the emperor, as a token submission. It's worth noting that the emperor would respond with gifts of his own, and the gifts that the emperor gave to the country paying tribute were usually worth more than the tribute itself. So people made out in this deal, and it served as a sort of trade. But that having been said, the express meaning of that exchange was that China was the superior power and the tributary was the subordinate. Another aspect of relationships between China and other nations was the expectation that the other country would submit to vassalage. Basically say, yeah, China, we acknowledge you're the big power, we're not. And that frequently would take the form of the kowtowing of the ambassadors to the emperor. Kowtowing was a ritual abasement of the ambassador to the emperor. Basically, you get down on your hands and knees. You can see a statue of someone kowtowing in the upper right-hand side. Kowtow comes into the English language through Cantonese. It's the name for that act, to basically get down on your hands and knees and tap your head to the emperor. So people expected China to be acknowledged as the dominant civilized power when China interacted with other nations under Manchu rule. The last slide for the pre-teaching is to discuss the economy. When the 19th century began, in the year 1800, China was one of the largest empires in the world, arguably the largest, definitely the largest, like with contiguous territory. The only one that might be larger is Russia, which was expanding across Siberia at this point. And it definitely had the largest economy in the world at that time, and also the largest population with over 300 million people. Roughly, China's population in 1800 was about the same as the United States today. China also had access to a lot of trade goods, luxury items that were highly desired in the West, specifically tea, porcelain, silk, and artwork. If you've ever heard porcelain referred to as China in the West, like I'm going to go buy some fine china, it's because in those days, porcelain was something that Westerners didn't know how to make, and so they associated it very much with China. It was a Chinese product. Silk was rare, tea was rare, especially the highest quality teas, and there was great appreciation for Chinese artwork, particularly antique vases, particularly ones from the Ming Dynasty, the last Han Dynasty, the one right before the Qing. So that's the situation as we enter the year 1800, and the reading that you guys will be undertaking today has to basically do with how did this situation change. I'm going to expect you to read through that and attempt the discussion questions. I would recommend answering those discussion questions in your notebook so that you can keep them. You're not going to be submitting those to me. When I come back next class, we'll discuss those questions together as a group, and then I will be giving you a quiz over the content of this slideshow and of the reading that you'll be doing. I hope that wasn't too painful, and I'll see y'all soon.